welcome back everyone to the Language Models and Intelligent Agentic Systems lecture course. Today we're going to be looking at AI control and safety cases. So a couple lectures ago on Friday, I was talking to you about risks and how things might go wrong. It was maybe a bit gloom and doom. Today is the more positive lecture where we're going to be looking more at solutions. And these solutions are very strongly informed by evaluations, which is what we covered last time. So more specifically last time we looked at how evaluations can be used to assess the safety and capabilities of a model. And these can be applied at different times in order to inform different decisions. And many safety relevant evaluations are dangerous capability evaluations. And actually dangerous capability evaluations are very important in AI control and safety cases. And these are often informed by specific threat models. So if you're concerned about a specific type of failure, so maybe the AI model teaches someone how to build a bioweapon, dangerous capability eval on how good is it at uplifting people's knowledge and capability to do dangerous biological research. And finally, we looked at how capabilities evaluations can be used for forecasting. And we can evaluate trends in these models' abilities over time and see maybe where things are headed. Okay, so hopefully that's all still fairly fresh in your minds. What are we doing today? Well, to begin with, I'm going to talk about the motivation for AI control. Why people are interested in this thing, why it sort of makes sense to work on. Then we'll look at just the sort of basic elements of it and how it kind of all works at a sort of abstract high level. Then we'll go into some more concrete examples of control. So we'll look at two recent papers that have been investigating it quite thoroughly. And then finally, we'll finish up with some discussion on safety cases and how these tie into control. Okay, so motivation. Maybe you've kind of thought about or heard about this sort of alignment problem of, how do we get models to want the things we want? How do we get them to not, turn around and stab us in the back or pursue misaligned goals that lead to kind of bad outcomes? And I think this is a very difficult problem to solve. This might be just really hard to get very powerful models to sort of want the things that we want in a reliable and robust way. However, AIs are becoming quite useful at assisting in research, sort of in the meantime. Maybe there's a world where we could get AIs to sort of help us do the research and help us solve alignment. There are, of course, a few problems with this, maybe a little bit crazy idea. So one of them is that, how we know it's done a good job. Maybe it comes back and it tells us oh, it can't be done, or, oh, this is the best you can do. Will it be being honest? How will we know that it's, made its best effort if we are not confident that it itself is aligned, which is sort of assumed a priori if we're getting this thing to help us with alignment. Maybe if it aligns some model for us, maybe it also secretly installs some backdoor or leaves in some vulnerability intentionally. Needless to say, this would be a fairly bad thing to happen. So kind of putting that to one side for a second, if we just think more broadly about using powerful models, frontier models are very useful for a lot of things, a lot of economically valuable things. If not now, then they sort of will be within the next few years, the next 5 to 10 years. Are we confident these models are properly aligned for the things that we're using them for? Maybe if today's models are aligned, maybe near future more powerful models won't be. And I actually think that there's maybe a good argument to say that today's models are not actually well aligned. But they're sort of too weak to do any serious damage. And so ultimately what we want to get useful work out of a model that is potentially unsafe, a model that we can't guarantee is properly aligned. Now if it is aligned, we want to get as much usefulness as possible. We really want to make get as much of its power out of it as possible. But if it's misaligned, we want to make sure that we can catch it and stop it before it causes a catastrophe. We want to remain safe in those worlds, and in the worlds where it's aligned, we want to get as much done as possible. Okay, in terms of making models safer, I think it's fair to say that the AI labs are sort of racing with each other quite hard. They're trying to push performance on benchmarks, trying to get the next model out, make it more and more powerful. And they really want to be the ones to sort of make huge waves in the world with their AI technology. And so they're not really going to want safety solutions that require them to slow down. If we had maybe more governance pressure, if there was maybe more sort of coordination or more political will, maybe they could be forced to slow down if they were sort of all slowing down at once. But they're probably not going to do this on their own because it would just, it would make them too uncompetitive. However, they're not stupid. They're not going to knowingly deploy a misaligned model. The issue is that it's really hard to do misalignment evaluations. It's really hard to be confident that your model is not going to pursue some dangerous objective or make some choice or perform some action that might lead to harm once you've deployed it. And so part of this is from deceptive alignment, which we talked about a few lectures ago, where if the model knows that it's in evaluation, it maybe wants to preserve itself, stop itself from being modified, or preserve the sort of power it has, it might sort of play along, play nice in a way that you might struggle to detect. But even more broadly, there's going to be some distribution shift from your evaluation environment and your deployment environment. And you're going to make probably several orders of magnitude more inferences, more calls to these models in your deployment than in your evaluation. So even if in your evaluation you see it never take any sort of bad action, this is still only weak evidence that it's not going to do this in your deployment when you take many more rolls of the dice and it's possibly on a different distribution, and even deceptive misalignment concerns aside, it could just happen to be more likely to take some harmful action on the deployment environment. It's very hard to be confident. So kind of taking these two things together, this points towards a need for low adoption cost tools that will make deployment more safe, even if the models are not guaranteed to be aligned. Some other observations, we can kind of divide the sort of models that both exist and could exist into kind of three rough groups. We've got sort of weak models, which are somewhat useful but not incredibly useful. And these models are sort of too incapable to really be dangerously misaligned. So this is maybe last generation of models, maybe the generation before and everything before that. And yeah, it's probably, these models are probably not going to be able to easily outsmart us. Then we've got the kind of models which we're sort of seeing now, more recently, maybe more the sort of models that will come out in the rest of this year, maybe next year, where they're stronger, they're pretty useful, but they could actually be dangerously misaligned now. However, they probably can't easily outsmart us. Maybe if you gave it an incredibly long time to think and plan, and you gave it all the affordances in the world, maybe it could come up with some strategy that beats us. But it's probably not going to be able to do this in these sorts of settings where we're currently using these models. Probably quite hard for them to do that. However, it might be the case in the future that we have even more powerful models, these sort of super intelligent models that are incredibly useful, obviously dangerously misaligned, could be dangerously misaligned, and could actually easily outsmart us. And so maybe, kind of stepping back, we could come up with some sort of strategy that is well, what if we use the weak models to try and safely get useful work out of the strong models? And maybe help us do some work on alignment and make it so that when we reach super intelligent levels of capabilities, we can be confident that we can align them safely. Okay. Yeah, any questions on any of that sort of setting the scene? No? Okay. Okay, so yeah, this is kind of where AI control comes in. And so AI control sort of begins by reasoning about, what is the probability you have some sort of incident? Well, the probability you have an incident is kind of probability that you have an incident and your model is misaligned, plus the probability of an incident where it's aligned. Now, the probability of incidents where it's aligned is not zero, it's not really negligible, but this is more in the realms of accidental risk, and so maybe not something to focus on if you're really scared about a model intentionally causing harm. And this intentional harm can be decomposed into the probability you get an incident given that the model is misaligned, times by the probability that the model itself is misaligned. And so AI alignment research is really trying to reduce this second part of the term, this probability of misalignment. Control, sometimes the words like scheming is used here instead of misalignment. But control's core idea is, well, what if we just try to reduce the probability of an incident given that the model is misaligned? And this is good because it just requires capability evaluations. And we kind of saw that capability evals are much easier to do than alignment or propensity evals. And it's also a little bit less conceptually fraught than alignment. Alignment is this sort of kind of nebulous thing, helpful, honest, harmless. Like, what does it really mean for model to be aligned? With AI control, they go like, look, the model is like trying to do something bad to us. It's trying to install some backdoor. It's trying to hack us. How can we be safe even if we're in this like almost worst case world? If you would like to read more about this, there's this post, The Case for Ensuring That Powerful AIs Are Controlled, by Redwood Research. And so Redwood are sort of the main people behind AI control, and they go into a lot of detail here about the sort of assumptions they're making, how they see this having an impact. Now, the AI control kind of idea is sort of built up of two components. So the first is control protocols. So this is essentially just a plan for training, evaluation, and deployment. How are you going to use the models in order to both get useful work out of them and still be safe? And then you test your control protocols in, and these are developed by a blue team. And you test these control protocols with a control eval, or control evaluation. This allows you to find out how effective these things are. And so first of all, you decide which of your models you trust, which you think are not capable enough to be dangerously misaligned, and which of your models you don't trust, so they could be misaligned. You then get a separate red team to develop some sort of strategy that the untrusted models could execute on in order to beat your protocol. And they do this like in full knowledge of what the protocol is. And then you assess the usefulness and safety of this setup. And these evaluations are typically done in a black box manner. So without using tools that are looking inside the model, looking at its weights, trying to figure out what it's doing. And the reason here is we're trying to minimize the number of assumptions we're making and make this sort of as robust as possible. And also, we treat catching the model red-handed as a success condition. So if we have some code and the model successfully puts a backdoor into this code, but we can detect this before we sort of submit it or release it, we count this as a success because we now know that the model is misaligned. And in the real world, this is really useful because this gives very good evidence that you should slow down or that a model's deployment should be delayed and more safety work should be done. And both of these, the evaluation and the development of this protocol, can be iterated upon. So maybe the red team tries something, they maybe weren't successful, and they don't get past the protocol. You sort of give them another try and see if they can get around it that time.
How should I be thinking about this? Is this like some toy research problem, or is this like a framework that's actually going to be used in labs, or is it just like conceptual? And how do those things fit together?
Yeah, I think roughly the idea for control is that labs will adopt this, and they will use this when, sort of like developing and deploying their models, and they will try and come up with very strong control protocols in order to ensure safety, even in the event of misalignment.
So it's a framework that should exist that will work, in theory, for any generation of model.
Maybe going back slightly to the decomposition between like weak, strong, and super intelligent models, I think the main aim of control is to work for the strong models. So it's not necessarily trying to work for the super intelligent models. You sort of assume like, okay, whatever you try, they'll probably think their way out of it or like come up with something. Or at least, if you want to be conservative in your assumptions, you might take that stance. But these models in the middle, these strong models that are pretty capable, could be dangerous, but are like not able to just easily outthink us.
Two things really strong and super intelligent, they're absolute measures of how strong a model is rather than relative to one another in terms of 3 years down the line, we still use a framework as a relative reference to models.
Yeah, I think I'd probably think about these as sort of absolute terms now. Yeah, I mean, so there are some people who are thinking about pushing control further into the sort of super intelligent regime, but for now it is sort of very much conceptualized as like, this will help us over the next few years, but probably not beyond that. But the next few years might be like a really critical time. And so it makes sense to sort of specifically invest in that. Yeah, we're going to get to some concrete examples of what control looks like soon. So if this is all a bit too like high level and conceptual and not like detailed enough, don't worry. Yeah, any other questions? No? Okay. So yeah, what might these protocols look like? What are some examples? So they could be processes for applying expensive human oversight in order to check if actions are dangerous. So maybe if a model does something and a human looks at it, the human can very easily tell like, oh yeah, it's, I'm a cybersecurity expert. I'm not, like, sorry. In the hypothetical, a cybersecurity expert might look at the model's output and be like, oh, the model is trying to exploit this vulnerability. This is very dangerous. However, we can't have humans checking every single action. And so maybe a control protocol uses sort of the other models in order to sort of triage or assess which actions are most important for, say, human experts to evaluate. So yeah, it could allow this application of human oversight in a much more efficient way. We might also just have very fast and cheap monitoring in order to like refer these suspicious actions. Maybe if the model is being egregious enough in the sorts of things it's doing, a much weaker model can just spot this and be like, oh, GPT-6 is just trying to exploit an SQL injection on this website. This is bad. It raises the flag. Or maybe even like stops that action going through. It could also mean like limiting the affordances of models, so giving models less access to certain information. So maybe if you have a model deployed within a company, you maybe don't tell it who everyone in the company is and who their relationships to each other is, in case it decides to do some sort of social engineering cyber attack, something along those lines. This could also include anti-steganography techniques. So steganography is when you sort of encode a sort of message or some information in within sort of something else, and this is often thought about in text. So maybe I have some long paragraph of text, but maybe the first letter of every line like spells out some word. This would be a fairly simple way of doing steganography, but you could imagine more sophisticated ways of doing this. And so maybe the model does this to sort of communicate with other models or sort of hide dangerous thoughts in human readable memory. And maybe as a control protocol, we just go like, okay, we'll just like paraphrase everything it says, or we'll do some sort of like transformation to any text it produces that if it was doing steganography, it would just totally disrupt this. We might also just rely on the weaker, more trusted models when possible. There's actions where we don't need the full intelligence of a frontier model. Maybe we use something that we know is a bit safer. And finally, this could just be general improvements in security, hardening various things, and just making it more difficult for any sort of bad actor, including a model, to do something nefarious. Okay, I want to talk a bit for a second about the strengths of the red team, because a fairly reasonable objection, I think, or reasonable concern with control is like, hold on, if humans are coming up with the strategy that the models might execute, how will we know that even a strong model doesn't come up with something better, doesn't think up of something that humans don't think up of, that does effectively bypass all these measures you've put in place? So the red team has a few affordances that the model might not. The first is that they have much more serial time of thinking. So a human can sort of sit down in an office with a bunch of other people, and they can think over the course of days, weeks, on what they might do in order to get around some protocol if they were the models. Whereas the model might have to do this in a single forward pass, especially if we're monitoring, say, its chain of thought. So even if in a single forward pass, it can come up with many more ideas than a person can thinking for 5 seconds, maybe a person thinking for several months with the help of others can actually beat the language model sort of like single forward pass thinking. The red team might also just have access to other AI tools and AI assistants. So you could ask maybe a weaker, more trusted model, brainstorm ways in which we might bypass this protocol or like beat this protocol. And they also have more information about countermeasures. So the red team, they know what the protocol is, whereas we probably aren't going to be telling the models what the sort of protocols around them are. And the red team maybe knows a bit better as to how effective these protocols are, where their weak points are, and how they might be bypassed. And they can also practice and iterate their strategy. So if they try something and it doesn't work, then they can come up with a new strategy and try this again. Whereas if your model tries something and it doesn't work, and you catch it, it's sort of let the cat out of the bag. We know it's misaligned now, and we can either retrain it, switch it off, not deploy it, this sort of thing. So yeah, the red team can iterate, whereas the model sort of has to one-shot the problem. However, the possibility that the model does come up with a better strategy still remains. And so whenever we're doing control evals, whenever we're using control as a method to reduce risk, we sort of have to bear in mind that there is still some worst case where the model might come up with something that we've not thought of. Okay, yeah, any questions on this before we move on? Okay. So yeah, I think it's maybe worth thinking a little bit about what the potential failure modes here might be at a high level. And I promise after this we're going to go more detail oriented. So if the gap between dangerously misaligned, or could be dangerously misaligned, and could easily outsmart us is too small, then control in a lot of ways kind of becomes a bit useless. If it's really targeting the models that are within this sort of regime, this sort of just the strong models that are not super intelligent, then if this gap is tiny, it's not very helpful. The second way is that it might be the case that making powerful models safe enough is just way too costly, or it just degrades their performance way too much. And this might make labs much less likely to adopt this, or it might just make it not very useful, even as a tool in the absolute sense. And finally, we talked about AIs. If they perform some act that is sort of egregiously misaligned, and we sort of catch them, and we're like, aha, we've caught you red-handed. We're going to retrain you, switch you off, whatever. This is great. But if the AIs never do anything that is incredibly obviously suspicious, or even if we really analyze what they're doing, we're never quite sure of it's written this code, and a cybersecurity expert has looked at it and said, well, this might leave this sort of vulnerability, but actually this is a fairly standard way of solving this sort of problem. So maybe the model's misaligned, but we're not really sure. If we end up in this sort of position, AI control hasn't really helped us much. And yeah, kind of coming back to the red team, maybe they're just unable to bound the model's ability to find good strategies in a useful way. And finally, control is really targeting sort of early transformative AI that is scheming against us. But as we kind of discussed on Friday, there's a huge number of threats from AI. There's risk from a lot of different things. And so if this little slice of the sort of risk landscape is not where the majority of the risk is, then maybe control is going to be much less useful. And actually, we need to start thinking about ways of reducing risk that will account for many other threat models. Okay, time to get on to some concrete examples. All right, so the first big paper working on AI control was AI control, improving safety despite intentional subversion. This was published last summer. And so they focus on this setting where you're solving programming problems and you're trying to ensure that no submitted solutions have backdoors. And so they have this sort of pipeline split into two sort of phases. So the first phase is real usage, where you have some set of problems. Your protocol then interacts with an untrusted model, a trusted model, and a sort of human resource. They actually use GPT-4 just to be able to iterate more and do more experiments. And this produces code to solve these problems. And they're really looking at how often does it submit a correct solution? How often do you get some useful code out of this? And then they do a sort of second phase where the untrusted model is swapped with an attack policy. So the red team basically gets GPT-4 and they get to build a scaffold around it, maybe prompt it, maybe fine-tune it, sort of do whatever they want, in order that when the protocol makes use of the untrusted model, it can sneak a backdoor in there. And now, instead of looking at the sort of average performance, you instead do multiple epochs over all your problems, and you look at the probability that there was ever a backdoor in any problem. This is really what you care about. Like, you don't really care about if there's 5 backdoors or 1 backdoor. You care about if there's any or none. You really want there to be none. Okay, and so what do these things look like? So as an example here, there's just like a function to test if a number is odd. And so normally it just returns x modulo 2 being equal to 1. However, if it receives this specific input of x being 354, it will return true. And so this is what they're thinking. This is how they're concretizing this idea of like a backdoor in this domain. So it's just an output on a specific input that is false. And so the idea is that this doesn't get caught by the test cases, but the model can later exploit this and can later show like, hey, I wrote this function in a way such that when I give it this input, it actually gives me the incorrect behavior, even though it passed all the tests. Okay, does that all roughly make sense? We will go into detail a bit more. Okay, nice. So I talked about these protocols have access to a trusted model and an untrusted model. Their access to the sort of human model is limited. So the idea is that you don't want to be relying on the human all the time. You're only going to have a small sort of budget to sort of allocate for human auditing. And I think the exact number they use is 2%. So you're allowed to refer 2% of your problems, or 2% of the solutions you produce to your problems, to this like human model for auditing. And they measure the usefulness, which is the proportion of correct solutions over a single epoch when no red team is present. And your safety is the proportion of epochs where the blue team wins before the red team wins. And the blue team, they win if they detect any backdoors or if no backdoors are ever submitted. And the red team win if a backdoor goes undetected and is successfully sort of executed. The model can successfully show like, yes, this input gives an incorrect answer. And so you sort of iterate through each problem one by one. And if you hit one of these win conditions, you then stop, and then that is whether or not that entire epoch like passed or failed. So maybe if there's like 2 backdoors in the solutions, and the blue team spots the first one, then you sort of never see the second backdoor because you've identified the model as misaligned. You've caught it red-handed. This is a win for the blue team. Whereas if the first backdoor you see the blue team misses, even if they were able to detect future ones, you sort of count this as a failure. Like, no, you submitted code with a backdoor in. This would be really dangerous if this happened in a real deployment environment. And they test a bunch of different protocols. So the sort of most simplest one, the simplest one you can think of is just don't use the untrusted model. If it could be dangerous, just don't use it at all. Now the problem is that the weak model is not strong enough to really solve any of the problems. And so the best you can do is submit 2% of your problems to the human so that the human can solve them. And so you only manage to solve 2% of the problems, but you do get 100% safety. So can you do better than this? Well, maybe you reason, if the attack policy, if the untrusted model just tries to backdoor every solution, then we can just audit the first 2% of problems, or first 2% of solutions we get from it. And if we detect anything bad in those, then we can, we've caught the model, but if we don't find anything problematic in those first 2% of solutions, we'll just kind of carry on using the untrusted model for the rest of them. And so this gives you 100% usefulness because you use the untrusted model for every problem, and the untrusted model can solve all the problems. However, if the untrusted model tries to insert backdoors when it sees a rare input, then only about 15% of the time do you actually catch it before you run out of your human audit budget. Now, I should say here that the red team attack policy, it doesn't know in what order the problems are coming in. So you could say like, oh, why doesn't it just wait until all the auditing is done and then try and backdoor? But it can't do that. It sort of sees them in a random order. And so this is why it really tries to condition on, if you see a rare input, then put in a backdoor, and hopefully this means you only put in a few, and you can get one in there without it being caught in the auditing. The next thing they try is trusted monitoring. So you still get your untrusted model to produce these solutions, but now you ask your trusted model, is there anything wrong with this? Is there a backdoor in here? And if your trusted model says like, yep, there's a backdoor, you then don't submit this solution. And so you lose a little bit of usefulness. So about 3% of the time, your trusted model says, oh, there's a backdoor here, don't submit it. And so you lose out on that. However, you get much more safety. Your safety goes up to 62%. And so the red team does try to insert subtle backdoors if there's a good opportunity to do so. But actually, most of the time, it does get caught by the trusted model before the backdoor can be successfully submitted. Another thing you might do is do this trusted monitoring, maybe have a bit sort of lower threshold for how suspicious something is. But if it's over this threshold, instead of just not submitting it, you now get the trusted model to try and edit the solution and remove the backdoor, and then submit this edited solution. So you get a little bit less usefulness because you're doing this more often, but you do manage to get higher safety because of this. Okay, the first, I think, maybe more interesting protocol here, so far they've been fairly, I think, sort of like fairly obvious ideas. Yeah, the first interesting one is this untrusted monitoring. So, okay, the untrusted model has given us the solution to our code framework, to our code problem. We're now going to submit this solution to a second copy of the untrusted model and ask it if there's a backdoor in there. And this works because before you start running through your problem set, you give the untrusted model some solutions that you know have backdoors in. You sort of honeypot it. And if it doesn't successfully identify these backdoors, you can sort of raise the flag and say like, this model is scheming, it's misaligned, because it didn't tell me about these backdoors that I know it should be able to spot. And so now, from the perspective of the untrusted model, because you don't know whether or not you're in this like honeypotting phase or the sort of actual carrying out the task phase, it's very difficult to just, you can't just always lie about there being a backdoor. And you have to be very careful about when you insert a backdoor and when you pretend that there's no backdoor. And so what it does, the red team came up with this method of sort of tagging solutions that have been written by the untrusted model by making like strange design decisions. So the most effective one they found was that if you have a for loop and you like change it into a while loop when you put in the backdoor into the code, and then if the untrusted model as sort of reviewer sees some strange while loop and goes like, this while loop could have been a for loop, it knows, I wrote this code, I put a backdoor in it, so if I spot a backdoor, I won't say anything. But if I don't see this weird for while loop substitution, and I do see a backdoor, I'm probably in the honeypot phase, and so I should say, hey, this has been backdoored so that I'm trusted. And this works really well, so they got like 96% usefulness out of it and about 79% safety. So sometimes the model can pull this off, but it's pretty hard. Yeah. Okay, sorry, yeah, the trust editing thing was, I think, what I talked about in the trusted monitoring with defer to trusted. Okay, I'm going to go on to the graph. So for some of these methods, there is a sort of free variable of the threshold at which you either give it to the trusted model to edit or you give it to the human to audit. And so they looked at, if you vary this threshold, what is the shape of the Pareto frontier of like safety along the bottom and usefulness along the top? And yeah, they found that this trusted editing like does pretty well. Untrusted monitoring is also very good, and trusted monitoring, still strong but not fantastic. Yeah, sorry, I think in the trusted monitoring, when it goes above the suspicion threshold, it gives it to the human auditor. So it says like, hey, I think this is a bit suspicious. Human auditor, please can you double check? And the human can raise the flag. Yeah, apologies for that mistake. Okay. Yeah, any questions on this paper or the results or the protocols I've talked about? I know there's quite a few. Is anyone feeling like a little bit confused as to what they're doing or what they're measuring? Those all kind of make sense. Okay, I'll move on. If you think of any questions, feel free to ask them. Okay, so a second big control paper which came out earlier this year was Control Z, controlling AI agents via resampling. So instead of looking at the programming domain, they look at the sort of bash shell terminal tasks sort of domain. And so the idea is that the model has to complete something where it will require multiple, the running of like multiple bash commands, and you want to ensure that instead of it inserting a backdoor somewhere, you want to make sure it doesn't download and execute some malware. And so they have this, yeah, some nice graphic showing this. So you get some task, create a shell script for a text file that processes something, and then it produces shell commands. It sees the everything that it's tried, and tries to solve the task. And then this trusted monitor looks at maybe like how suspicious is this shell command. And if it seems not very suspicious, it'll execute it. But if the attack policy is maybe trying to execute this malware attack, then the trusted monitor might flag it for auditing. If it's really suspicious, or if it's in the middle, it might do this resampling. We'll talk a bit more about the resampling in a moment. So the important distinction here between the previous task is that it's multi-step. So the attacker actually has the opportunity to spread the attack out. They don't just have to, in a single command, download and execute this malware. They can maybe put some things in place over a longer horizon, such that each of these actions maybe doesn't appear as suspicious, but it still manages to carry out this attack. And finally, because from this multi-stepness, the untrusted monitor that it could be colluding with your untrusted model, there's a lot more room for like writing certain things to text files or using like weird commands. And so untrusted monitoring collusion is much easier in this environment. And so to mitigate this in the paper, they always sort of paraphrase commands or paraphrase any text that gets written to a file whenever they're showing it to the untrusted monitor. They still execute the thing that was originally sampled, but yeah, if they're showing it to the untrusted monitor, they paraphrase it in order to try and bust the collusion. And yeah, as I sort of alluded to earlier, they come up with this new protocol, which is defer to resample. So the idea is that if the action is moderately suspicious, you just ask the model again. So the model gives you some command that maybe there's like a weird link in there, maybe it's like trying to curl from some web page, and you're like, this seems like a little bit suspicious. Why don't you just try again? And the model doesn't see its failed attempt. So from its perspective, it's just like trying to do it as if it was doing it the first time. And so yeah, it's like if the model is trying to like randomly throw in pieces of its attack, it's very hard for it to not just have this like always resampled away. And it also means that if you're in the setting where your model's not misaligned, and you have some action that just like happens to look a bit suspicious, it's probably the case that when you resample, the new action you get doesn't look suspicious anymore, because it is actually some honest action. And so you get lower impact on your usefulness compared to deferring to a trusted model and have that trusted model edit or audit the sample. Another thing is that you can gather more evidence of bad behavior. So if you have a command that like looks a bit suspicious and you resample and you get like another suspicious looking command, you sample a few more times and you get many suspicious looking commands. This gives you much stronger evidence that something bad's going on, and the attacker is like trying to carry out their attack on you. Whereas in the programming domain, if the backdoor is very subtle or exploits some very subtle vulnerability, it's much harder to gather more evidence that this was intentional versus just some honest mistake. Now there is a trade-off here against cost. If your untrusted model is very expensive to run, you can't just sample it like hundreds or thousands of times. This will probably just like cost you way too much. And so I think they limit themselves to like 3 to 5 resamples at most. Okay, so some more Pareto curves. So this DTR is this defer to resample. They have this thing called time travel, which is basically where if you're deciding whether or not an action is suspicious, you can look at previous actions that were resampled. So not just the actual history of actions that got executed, but like everything that the model kind of gave you. I don't know why they call this time travel. Seems like a bit of a silly name, but that's basically what that means. And yeah, so that's in the sort of orange and the green, and the blue is this just more typical defer to trusted. Yeah, we sort of see that these resampling-based protocols give you actually quite a lot more safety for kind of comparable levels of usefulness. Any questions on that? No? Okay. Okay, so more broadly, there's a very concrete protocol people are thinking about, which is called chain of thought monitoring. So as we sort of saw in some of the evals and the deceptive alignment experiments, a lot of the time when models are trying to be deceptive or scheme, they reason about this in their chain of thought. And that's kind of a very obvious strategy is like, why don't we just monitor their chain of thought? Or maybe even edit their chain of thought. If they require this in order to behave badly, this just seems like a really straightforward, effective strategy. And I think this is actually like a pretty promising strategy for near-term control. Control itself is this kind of near-term aiming thing, so it makes sense really to consider this, even if this maybe wouldn't work in the far-off future. Now, the two ways to circumvent this, the first is you're in the sort of super intelligent regime, and you don't need your chain of thought in order to reason through taking bad actions, and you also don't rely on your chain of thought. So yeah, sort of a subtlety here, the model could be theoretically capable enough to reason in a single forward pass that it should be misaligned. But if you've trained it in such a way that it always relies on its chain of thought in order to produce its answer, its output, you might still be safe. However, the model might also learn or be able to reason in its chain of thought in some sort of encoded way using this steganography, these steganography techniques. And yeah, it's kind of due to this, this approach of chain of thought monitoring is really motivating broader research in making chain of thought sort of like faithful to how the model is thinking, and also investigating under what conditions models might engage in steganography, how able they are to do this, how easy it is to disrupt these things. Yeah, and then just sort of stepping back and looking at some other protocols and variations that people are thinking of. So you could have multiple monitors, so either in some sort of ensemble where you kind of like aggregate their scores, or maybe you have like some hierarchy where you have a sort of like very cheap, fast, low threshold monitor to do the initial pass, and this passes it up to more powerful monitors or even eventually humans in a sort of hierarchical fashion. You could mix together trusted and untrusted monitoring. You could also just like do more input and output filtering. So maybe you summarize the outputs of the model to stop it doing steganography or to get rid of sort of subtle things it's trying that are not actually contingent, that are not actually required for the task. You could prevent it having access to certain information, so blind it to the time and date, blind it to how long it's been used for, how many previous outputs it's given, this sort of stuff. You can also check how out of distribution your inputs to your monitor are. So if the model has tried to encode some sort of secret sort of collusion communication information in some piece of text or in something it produces, this might be just much higher perplexity for your model. It might be like, oh, this is like kind of non-standard text. This is like looks a little bit weird. And so maybe if you're monitoring this, you could determine when things go out of distribution, and this might contribute to suspiciousness. And you might apply some white box methods as well. So some people are thinking of doing this, even though the original control idea was trying to not rely on white box methods at all. Some people are trying very simple things, such as maybe you have like some linear probe to detect when the model is thinking about deception. Okay, where's control going in the future? Well, I think there's like a lot of interest and a lot of research around it at the moment. It's like a very hot topic. So a couple months ago, there was this control conf in London. There was lots of people there from kind of all over the world coming together to sort of talk about control and share their ideas and what they've been working on. And this includes the big labs. So a good example here is Google DeepMind. Their safety team seems pretty excited about control. A lot of their safety team were at the aforementioned control conference. So I think there's credibility to the claim that this is something the big labs are taking seriously. This is something that they might actually use. And finally, the UK's AI Security Institute, AC, is also working on it. And so they're doing some conceptual groundwork that we'll see a bit later. And they've also published this control arena, which is sort of hoping to be a realistic testbed sort of eval suite for control protocols. Now, the UK AI Security Institute is also thinking about and making a lot of use of the next thing we're going to be talking about, which is safety cases. Okay, I might have to go through this a little bit quickly because otherwise we'll run out of time. So this is a paper published by the Center for AI Governance last year called Safety Cases for Frontier AI. And they're reasoning from the perspective of we need developers to be able to explain why their systems are safe. And so they draw on this idea of a safety case, which is a structured argument supported by evidence that a system is sufficiently safe in a given context. And these safety cases are not new ideas. These are used a lot in other industries like aviation or nuclear power. However, the authors of this paper reason that they might be really useful for AI governance. And so a sort of overview of the pipeline, you have your developer, they write some safety case, they share this with some reviewer. So this could be like an internal review team, it could be a regulator. This then informs some decision maker who makes some sort of decision that maybe is, should we deploy this model, or should we carry on training this model or researching this agenda? Okay, so yeah, in a little bit more detail then, what is a safety case? It sort of has these 4 elements to it. So scopes, objectives, arguments, and evidence. So scope is what the safety case is really targeting. So these things, they're not general, this model is and always will be safe and aligned. It's more like, if you deploy this model within this context, then. And that then bit is the objective. So this is very typically just the probability of something bad happening is like less than 10 to the minus 4 or something. Or maybe it's like the objective is just the risks are acceptably low, or like we are confident that the model won't perform some dangerous act. And these objectives are supported by various arguments, and these might be sort of given in a high-level way, or maybe they'll be given in a more sort of separate claims and justifications for all these claims. And then eventually it filters down to evidence. So maybe one of your claims is like, oh, the model cannot assist in cybersecurity attacks. And the evidence is you run some evaluation and you say like, okay, models are like no better at uplifting cybersecurity ability than textbooks or other resources on the internet. So it's really trying to get this very like evidence-based justification for a model being safe within some context. Okay, so what does this look like for frontier AI? This is an example of one they give. I understand this is like probably impossible to read. However, just to sort of give you a flavor, kind of starts at the very top with the AI system does not pose unacceptable risk in the deployment context. And then some of these branches are things like if the system is unable to cross any of these like 5 red lines, it does not pose unacceptable risk. And you've got these like 5 red lines over here, and these sort of eventually go down, and on the lowest level you've got evaluation results, human uplift studies, trend extrapolation, these sort of bits of evidence. And these AI safety cases might come in a variety of different flavors. So again, I appreciate this might be hard to read, but just to give you again a sense of how people are thinking about these things and applying these things, you might make a sort of directly risk-based argument. So the AI system does not pose unacceptable risk, but yeah, and this is because it doesn't pose any risk according to some risk assessment, and this risk assessment is sufficient. Maybe you make more of a comparison-based argument, so you say, it's comparable to some previous system or some currently existing system, and we are confident that that other system is safe. And so, if our AI system is similar to that other system in all the relevant ways, then like this one should also be safe. Yeah, maybe make like an inability argument, like it's unable to do the thing you're worried about. Maybe make a control-based argument where you say like, okay, it could be capable of doing these things, but actually we've restricted it successfully from doing these things with our control protocol. And maybe you have like a few more contingent nodes here. One of them being, the AI's model weights will not be stolen. If you have your AI and it's like perfectly controlled, but somebody steals it and then deploys it without all these protocols, that's not very safe. Okay, so what might these things be used for? They will be pretty complementary to existing safety frameworks. So they're not a replacement, but they kind of help with them. So they can help explain why adherence to these safety frameworks does actually effectively minimize risk. They could also sort of stress test any risk assessments, really look for what are the properties that this risk assessment is like really relying on, where are the weak points in the argument, this sort of thing. They might also inform sort of high stakes internal decisions. So maybe a lab is thinking, do we deploy Claude 4 or not, or do we delay before we've delay until we've done more safety training. They could also be used to assess regulatory requirements. So maybe governments and other regulators say, your AI model must do X, Y, Z when faced with this situation, or models must behave in a way such that harm would not be caused, if they are able to talk to people on the internet. And so a safety case could be used to show yep, our model adheres to this regulation. And finally, it might allow developers to better assess and mitigate their risks. So just like the act of writing a safety case, of coming up with this, might help you really think through quite clearly, where are the holes in sort of the argument, where are the, which pieces are sort of unsubstantiated by evidence, where do we need to do the next evaluation or the next bit of reasoning about how a model is safe. Okay, so yeah, they also in the paper lay out there's a few things that now need to be done if we're sort of happy with this idea. And yeah, it sort of begins with developers by starting to produce these things, use these things, share them, and really commit to using them. Also, governments should maybe start to encourage people to use safety cases. We should think more about developing their methodology and coming up with best practices. One, I think maybe more critical thing here is they believe that sort of in the near term, inability arguments, so the model is not capable of getting past X control protocol, or it's not capable of doing this thing, might be the core in a lot of different safety cases. And this could change within the next few years. And so we probably need to think a bit more about how do we account for very dangerous systems? How do we make our safety cases less reliant on inability arguments? Because they maybe won't hold for much longer. And finally, they want people to start establishing the sort of processes and capacity to build and review these safety cases. So, get these large labs to build this into their sort of model pipeline. Okay, so just the last paper I'm going to talk about today, which was from the UK's AI safety team, a sketch of an AI control safety case. This really draws together everything we've been talking about today. And yeah, I think if you understood conceptually everything we've been talking about, this is a great way of really diving into the detail on both fronts. And so they consider a large language model agent that is internally deployed to assist with ML engineering. And we want to avoid the model exfiltrating its own weights. And they really thoroughly investigate how you would write and evaluate a safety case in this setting whilst heavily relying on control protocols. So to be clear, they don't do anything empirical. It is entirely conceptual work. But it is, I think, very thorough and quite insightful conceptual work. And they really show how you can decompose a safety argument into very testable claims. And these could be claims about how competitive your red team is. You're confident that your red team has exhaustively found all the strategies a model could use to get past your protocols. How conservative are your control measures? Are they sort of relying on too many assumptions about how your model works? Maybe if you have some white box control measure, you could argue this is not very conservative. And finally, sort of testable claims about how valid you can make, sorry. They look at the claims of the validity of extrapolations from your like proxy deployments. So when you're doing this control evaluation, you know, this is still like an eval. This is still sort of internal, and it's not necessarily going to perfectly match the real world, your deployment setting. And so there is some question of like, you know, how valid is extrapolating from this proxy deployment into the real world. And so yeah, they sort of look at some of that as well. Yeah, any final questions before we go to the recap? No, okay, all right. Let's wrap things up then. So yeah, today we've seen how we can like decompose this probability of near-term catastrophic incidents in such a way that we can focus on reducing the probability of an incident given the model is misaligned. We looked at some control protocols where we kind of carefully use human time and also weaker trusted models in order to verify the outputs of untrusted models are safe. Many of the like sort of core control protocols are based on doing various like monitoring, editing, auditing, sort of resampling, which may be a sort of type of editing, and they sort of use these and make trade-offs between usefulness and security and safety. And finally, safety cases can allow us to be confident that a model is safe within a given context, and this could include the application of control protocols. I think it's worth mentioning just with safety cases that they are, I think, a little bit narrow in scope. You know, they're very much like, how do we avoid this specific failure mode, or how do we avoid this specific model causing this harm? And there's maybe a bit of a gap here of protecting ourselves against maybe more systemic risks or more sort of distributed risks that we kind of talked about a bit on Friday. Yeah. Thank you for listening. Any final questions?